They don't go to work. They don't get food. They don't go to work. They don't get food. They don't go to work.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This is Firoze Manji from the Raja Press.
They don't go to work. They don't get food. They don't go to work.
As many of you will know, we are witnessing a new chapter in Kenya's history, which is being written by young people of what has been called Gen Z, who are expressing their discontent, undergoing political awareness, and collectively protesting in their thousands for a life free of poverty and humiliation.
We're running street battles between protesters and police here in the center of Nairobi. Also, the main road to the city has been blocked. And there are protests in other parts of the country as well, in the port city of Mombasa and in the western...
In their messages and actions, these protesters have made it clear that their demands for change in Kenya goes beyond the policy reforms and the stopping of the financial bill, but actually challenges the heart of global power relations and of capitalism as it manifested in Kenya under neo-colonial conditions.
And all of a sudden, there's an explosion. We are seeing this younger generation, this Gen Z generation, on the streets now trying, not just articulating their grievances, but pushing for a new kind of change. Some people have already called this moment a third liberation.
As Kenyans take to the street to exercise their democratic rights, I took the opportunity of getting in touch with Joe Kobuthi, who is a scholar and advocate and who holds a master's degree in philosophy and public policy. He has a long career in advocacy and has been a senior editor of the elephant.info, a prestigious Pan-African magazine where he has worked for the last 8 years. He has produced some amazing materials related to his commitment to amplify critical African voices, as well as supporting the struggle for social justice and freedom. So I am very pleased to have Joe Kobuthi join us today to discuss the background and the conditions that led to this amazing uprising in Kenya.
They don't go to work.
Joe Kobuthi, welcome to the Raja Press podcast. It's a real pleasure to meet you at long last. I've heard so much about you. I've read so much that the elephant.info does some amazing journalism and analyses. So a warm welcome to you.
Thank you so much, Firoze, for having me as well. I've read you since I was in my youth, so thank you so much for having me here.
It's our pleasure. There's been an extraordinary month that we have experienced with mass mobilizations taking place, things that I would never have dreamt of happening in Kenya. A courageous, heroic mobilization, an attempt to occupy parliament, which actually belongs to Wananchi, and the calling for the resignation of the president. None of us would have a month ago expected that this is what would happen. So it'd be really helpful if, Joe, if you could help us understand what led to these extraordinary events.
So I think maybe a bit of a long-winded history. I'll start it from 1976, and then I'll compare it to an event that happened in Kenya's history that we forget about. So in 1976, ILO published a paper and it was a report and said that Kenya is facing an unemployment crisis, that if nothing is done, there's going to be about 6 million graduates out of work in next coming years. Of course, political class ignored that. It was not their concern. Then, it was not their concern. So, it was shelved. Of course, the 1980s came with the infamous SAP's program by IMF and World Bank. So we went through that. Kenya was adjusted aggressively. What came out of that was a fractured society. Society was completely fractured. People came out of it in their own silos. Of course, in the 1990s, of course, with a push of multi-party, there was a bit of a step forward. So in as much as the unemployment bug was not at the core of things in the cost of living, there were other political issues. So the 1990, we pushed for multi-party democracy. So those are the political reforms conversation was really at the center of political change in the 90s. Though this economic problem was really at the backbone of it. Or rather, the assumption was if you fix the politics, the economy will also be fixed, as the late President Moi used to say, maisha mbaya, siasa mbaya, maisha mbaya. So the assumption was if you fix the politics, therefore also we get the economy right. So we push in the 90s, still the same problem. 2002 comes with the NAC wave, and we remove Moi, and so much excitement. And momentarily there, of course, the Kibaki regime tries the developmental state. Of course, it failed within many regards, particularly around tribalism and things like this. But momentarily there was an expansion of universities, expansion of the economy. All of a sudden, the economy was now growing again, coming from deficit or negative to now positive numbers. So we're growing at 6-7%. At its highest, we're at actually 7.9% between 2005, 2006, and 2007, just before post-election violence. Even with the blip of post-election violence, the economy is still growing. So there was still that level of enthusiasm, and particularly for what you'd call the middle classes. So maybe not for the masses, but the middle classes, graduates were getting jobs, etc. We had all these things coming up, the Equities, Safaricoms, and all these other local organizations that were becoming national conglomerates were coming up to the scene. So there was a sense of the economy is growing, right? And then, we come to Uhuru Kenyatta's regime, and things started going south then. First, we started having a stagnation between 2013 and 2014, an economic stagnation, particularly around the economy not able to absorb as many people as fast as it was in the preceding 10 years of the Kibaki regime. But then the failure of the previous regime was that we got into this debt treadmill where we started out getting into borrowing debt, but then two are getting to what economists can now, have deemed white elephant projects. So instead of getting into projects that could catalyze capital expansion, rapid capital expansion, the previous regime got into projects that they could amass wealth through corruption and embezzle resources. So we go into this. So we go into this system, and then come to 2022. President Ruto campaigns on the backbone of a bottom-up, uses immense language, revolutionary language of freedom is here, freedom is coming, bottom-up economic model. It's a government of Mamboga, and boda, and the proletariat kind of conversation. So in a sense, his campaign is what gives political language to what we are seeing now. And then he comes into power, but then knowing who he is and where his political history, he reverts back to type. So he reverts back to largesse, to opulence, and to what his regime for the last 20 months has. And all of a sudden, there's an explosion. In 2022, which is interesting, there were something like there was a silent majority of people who didn't vote, to the extent of maybe 7 million people, largely youth, who didn't vote. So what you saw was the usual 14 million people who voted for Raila, people who voted for Rulo. They were just the usual older kind of political players, but you had this silent majority who didn't vote. And in a sense, this is what we are seeing is them on the streets. We are seeing this younger generation, this Gen Z generation on the streets, not just articulating their grievances, but pushing for a new kind of change. Some people have already called this moment a third liberation. I think it is, because I wrote about it, but I think it's much more deeper than third liberation. I think the public sphere has now evolved to a space where, at least at a local level, it's now agitating for change. But this change, in my mind, I know nothing about it. In Kenya's history, we saw this kind of move in 1952. Because we read the history of the Mau Mau as this one organized thing, but what people don't forget was that the preceding months to Sir Evelyn Baring declared state of emergency was because this thing that the Wazungus called a Mau Mau was not this, as we read it in history today, was not this one central organized animal. It was, you had labor strikes, you had what we call the Mau Mau in Central Kenya, taking up arms, you had boycotts. So in a sense, Kenya has been here before, but we can't locate it in history because of how our history was told. So in a sense, the Mau Mau was perceived as this one central thing, but it was just part of many pain points of the system. And I think the only person who has articulated this well was a leftist, a book by Bergman, Crisis and Control. He wrote about this, the political violence of colonial Kenya. He wrote about it. And he's the only person who articulates that actually it was the point where the colonial system gets to a point where very few people can control an angry mob. And what happens is that the revolt doesn't come up within one central space, but it's leaderless, it's tribeless. It's exactly what we are seeing today, where the state as it is currently is unable to reconstitute itself, whereby it's unable to met enough violence to the masses for them to quell them. So what we're now seeing is now a revolt coming very organically through the Gen Z generation. It becomes the face of revolt towards the whole society. And it's what we are seeing. We are seeing people very unorganically. Now we saw the doctors today in the Ministry of Health camping there for the last 2 days. We've seen guys in Narok, we've seen guys in Mombasa. It's completely organic. It's really the people now pushing back the colonial state and pushing for, this is not even pushing for reforms, but pushing for a transformation. Really, they're pushing for it to become an inward-looking tool, because one of the fundamental logics of the colonial state is that it's an outward-looking tool where it's always serving foreign interests. But we're now seeing, just as we saw in 1952, and we're seeing now, is that now there's an aggressive push for it now to become an inward-looking entity for the needs and the priorities of the people.
I find it very interesting that you started with 1976 and the ILO report. And I'm glad that now that you've mentioned the early 1950s and the rise of the multiple movements calling for self-determination, calling for freedom, for human emancipation. And you're right to say it wasn't just the Land and Freedom Army, which was called by the colonials the Mau Mau, but it was the labor movement. There were extraordinary number of events happening all over the place. But I think the reality wasn't the reality that, in fact, by 1955, that movement had been crushed, defeated. They'd used all kinds of, more or less what Israel is doing in Palestine today, and the use of concentration camps, the experimentation with napalm across the areas where the Land Freedom Army was located. And I think it's important, I feel, that what we are talking about is a defeat of the liberation movement by 1955. And that laid the premise for the creation of the Tai movement, the new neo-colonial regime. And I think you're very right in talking about what is happening as a challenge to the colonial state, and in fact, the neo-colonial state. And I think that's a very important definition. The other thing I think we also have to say, so you have Jomo Kenyatta, the founding neo-colonial father, followed by Arap Moi, who took his Nyayo to its conclusion, that is of despotism. And then we had Kibaki, who at least opened some space and created an environment where we were once again not just tribal, we were Kenyans. But then I think the one event that I think for understanding today, perhaps, is that Kibaki came back on the basis of a coup. The downward spiral began surely with the coup and the establishment of indeed a hidden presidential ceremony. So I think these are I would suggest things which are relevant to understanding what is happening today. Well, I'd like your comments on that.
So I think there are many threads, and I think that and I think analysts and writers and journalists have to patch this stuff. So I think I like the idea. So in one hand, there are many strands happening. On one hand, there's a strand that I mentioned where we have been here before, where this is really another pushback for the transformation of the colonial state. Though, because it happens at an academic level, it happens very dialectically. So there was, as you rightly say, 52, you had the diehards pushing for land and freedom. Then also you had by 1955, and even within, for instance, even the Kanu party, in 1960, you had the radicals on one hand, you had the moderates, you had the conservatives. And I think even that dialectical within that transition, and plus what's happening globally, what happens, that the dialectical conversation that happens, that what we had out of that mishmash is this thing called independence, not liberation, not land and freedom, but it's the independence project. So that's what we had. So I think similarly, if we were to look at Kenya has been on a particular, the last political strand, in my view, Kenya has been on a particular strand. It's actually been 2007. Post-election violence happened. And as Professor Ogot had said 2 years earlier at a conference, the Kenyan project had died. And he said that in 2005, and nobody took him seriously. Only Pastor Kantai, who wrote about him in his piece, The Ridiculous Generation, nobody else took him very seriously. In 2007, the post-election violence came, meaning God's prophecy comes to pass, meaning that the soul of the nation is fractured, and something fundamentally happened in 2007. But it was almost like there was an unfinished process that was happening. It was unfinished because, we know Kofi Annan and Condoleezza Rice and all these people, and then we had an elite pact and a settlement, which leads up to the 2010 constitution. But when it happens, of course, when the next regime led by Kenyatta comes to power, nothing. The spirit of the constitution is actually stifled from the word go. And interestingly, Kenya votes for 2 ICC inductees back to back. First Uhuru Kenyatta, then William Ruto. And I think what we are seeing now as one of the many strands, particularly at a local level, is the unfinished business of 2007 mishap, where we're now forcing, because that thing that didn't die is now being destroyed completely in this Gen Z protest. Lack of accountability, tribalism, the Madharau, particularly the Madharau that has been meted by politicians, which we're now taking them to social jail. I saw a recent photo of a recent clip by a nominated senator, and she was in a club, she was dancing, and guys threw off the stage in order to leave. So so I think there's an unfinished business that now is culminating from 2007. We're now seeing its final reprieve, where Kenyans are now saying this has to die. This particularly strand has to die. This Madharau.
For the benefit of our listeners, what does Madharau mean?
Oh, Madharau is disdain. It's a disdain. This sense of elite hubris. Actually, hubris from your elites, whereby it's interesting. Even guys are commenting on social media, taking clips, how you're seeing ministers in their cars waiting in the traffic jam. They're not overlapping because of just there's a social jail that Kenyans have taken our political class to, and guys are saying enough is enough. We won't give you enough bandwidth to just sustain your hubris. So I think what we are seeing is an end of a particular kind of politics for sure, and an end of a particular formation of Kenya's architecture. And because of that end, our political class are out of their depth. So they are reverting to the old tricks. You can see, like for instance, recently Ruto has invited Raila for some kind of handshake, and Kenyans are asking, okay, but this is great, but who cares? This has nothing to do with us. We didn't go to the streets because Raila organized us. So that they're trying to look for a kind of political establishment because that's all they know. Dr. Joyce Nyeri talks about the 3 helixes that hold the bane of Kenyan democratic: Harambees, handouts, and handshakes. And they're trying to, those three things is what the things they know. And I think we're that space where society has moved further than our political establishment, and it doesn't know what to do. It doesn't know what to do because, and the reason why it doesn't do, because whereas to answer the questions of governance were easier, to answer the question of livelihood, extremely painful, because it means they have to reorganize the state to be inward looking. What that means for Western powers is another question for our elites. Because to paraphrase Fanon, the African bourgeoisie class, they act as middlemen. If they are to now abandon their middleman role and now go to take themselves to school to the people and now reorganize the state for it to have an inward-looking role for the benefit of the state, what that will mean for Western powers, one, but not what it mean for our political class in the phase of colonization, as Fanon is a useless phase of history. I think for me are much bigger questions. Because now I know it's not the question, but now to my mind, now if you speak in terms of global politics, there are four interesting things that are happening globally that are very keen towards imperialism and the end of empire and the end of the Western hegemony. Interesting things that have taken place last couple of years now that I think for us is very keen to watch. The first one was the Ukraine war, because it was an assault of expansion of the West, really the last bastion of that area of the world that has not been colonized by them. It was under it was under it was still under the USSR and under Russia, under Russian influence. So the Ukraine war was really an assault, a last frontier kind of conversation of capital within that space. And I think the Ukraine war was one of the first events we had to watch in terms of really one of the last kicks of a dying horse, the Ukraine. The second one was Gaza, which was very important, and Palestine, very important, because Noam Chomsky has articulated this many times. Why Israel has as many guns as America is because they're both apartheid states, one. But for me, my argument, in addition to that as well, was that a part of Western hegemons' rise to power was the idea of America's manifest destiny. But also, and manifest destiny was, from a biblical interpretation, was to restore the nation of Israel back to its people. So when America took that role in their hands, it gave itself, one, it gave itself a theological imperative, but then two, it also gave itself a godlike status, where we as a Western hegemon, our role is we have this godlike role to do these kind of things. And that's why the Palestine-Gaza is very important, because it demystifies the manifest destiny of the US and the Western hegemony in broadly. And the third thing was Haiti. Haiti, as we all know, was the first black free slave state, after the 1804 and 1813 war. We know that, and we know the bane of the Haiti is always, what does is that blackness, to quote Cohn and other scholars, blackness that pushed back on whiteness, it's a testimony that whiteness, it doesn't have a godlike status. And I think suppressing Haiti, as we have seen the last couple of centuries, what it does to the scourge of whiteness is that it reminds them of their humanity and not their godlike status that they gave themselves in the last 500 years of empire expansion. And then, and tied to Haiti is also Kenya. Kenya sent police to Haiti. Fanon had always mentioned many times that Kenya was a perfect colony. So in a sense, were really the house Negroes of empire, really were the reason why the Kenyan passport for a long time was really the emblem of house negritude, in a house Negroism in a sense. So for us now, and I think what was happening in Kenya, what was happening the last couple of months with the US ambassador, with all the stuff that was happening, of course, grooming President Ruto as the US lucky. In fact, 3 weeks before the protests, President Biden in the White House dinner had said that there's a light coming away from East Africa, talking about President Ruto. So in a sense, so Kenya was really in my mind, was the fourth event that now has cracked now empire, and now it's naked. And now what we are seeing now is really the last days of empire, because now all these events have now come together. And what we are seeing now is an implosion of the West, really. The West, really, in terms of this is a dying colonialism, as Fanon talked about it, and we're actually now seeing it in real time, because we have seen is that the Kenyans have risen up to push back against, really, of course, Ruto, but by extension, the IMF and World Bank and the West. And now, what all these things are happening, and we're seeing, we're reclaiming our flag with, we're performing in Uhuru Park and all these things. There's a psychological and a spiritual, but even material pushback, not just in Kenya, but all these 4 events happening towards now the greater discourse of end of empire. And I think for me, to where I'm stood, I think that's the most important conversation. Not negative what's happening in Kenya, it's beautiful, but I think locating this conversation within the global forces, I think it's important even for strategy, for the movement, but also for what happens next. I mean, I think yesterday 9th we saw the US leaving Niger and Burkina Faso with Ibrahim Traore, and we're seeing a new political formation happening in the Sahel. And we're seeing a real reconfiguration of the world order in real time, not from the center, but from the periphery. So to my mind, we're actually now seeing that this is not really the end of empire coming down. But of course, what we have not yet seen now is the blowback, the assault, the direct assault coming not just in Africa, but in Asia, in other spaces now, as even other forces are reorganizing the world in real time.
I think it's very helpful to put it that way, although I think the timeline for the collapse of empire is slightly longer than we would hope. You're listening to the Daraja Press podcast. Daraja is the Kiswahili word for bridge. As its name suggests, Daraja Press seeks to build bridges, especially bridges of solidarity between and amongst movements, intellectuals, and those engaged in struggles for a just world. Check out our other episodes, books, and more at darajapress.com. So now let's get back to the show. Going back to looking at what's happening in Kenya, I mean, is this merely a protest? Is it an uprising like we saw in Tunisia and Egypt a few years ago? Or am I hearing you saying that this is the beginnings of a revolution? You're saying that the state is no longer able to rule. They still have their police and army, the Kenya Defense Forces. I'm not convinced that this is a weakening of the state. There's certainly a challenge to Ruto, but are the oligarchs, is the state as opposed to the government really being challenged?
It's a good question. So I think to use those political terms clearly, I think one can say we are really, currently we are an uprising, depending on the strategic maneuvers of the Gen Z protests for it to become a revolution. There are certain things that need to be done, particularly around intellectual work, for it to move from just outright rage to now really contesting the state at a different level. So what we are seeing at this level is an uprising where the younger generations have mobilized themselves organically, and it's an organic level where they are challenging the modus operandi of the state. They're not challenging its existence; they're challenging how it operates. So it's accountability, it's end of corruption and largesse, it's hubris, particularly of elected officials and how they treat people. It's no jobs. So what we are seeing is not a challenging of the existence of the state, but in a sense, it's pushing back, challenging its modus operandi, how it operates. So in a sense, it's really what they're really doing is they're breathing life into constitutionalism, right? So in a sense, it's really the unfinished business of 2007, as I said earlier, whereby they're saying that Kenya is over.
But what we saw in the Egyptian uprising and in the Tunisian one was that suddenly it wasn't simply a protest. there were the beginnings of the organizing of healthcare, of childcare, of feeding, in other words, there was an evolving alternate way of making decisions, of alternate ways of working together. These are sort of always the elements of that shift from uprising to the beginnings of the elements of a potential revolution. In other words, a self-organization of people. To what extent do we see elements of that arising, or are we still in that level of protest stroke uprising?
I think we're still at the level of protest and uprising, only to the extent of what you've mentioned. To the extent that we're seeing this revolution, it's the self-organizing logic of how organic it is. I think that's the only step that we are seeing it moving towards a revolution of how organic and how self-organizing, in the sense of you get a clip maybe on your phone and you're seeing youth in Kisii. They have gone to the governor's office and they have this particular issue. I remember 2 weeks ago, I put up a clip of youth in Kiambu, and they had watched the governor's office, and the issue was land grievances. So towards that extent is when we can see it being a potential revolution towards that extent. But it becoming, we are yet to see intellectual elements of the uprising now beginning to organize to the extent of creating an alternative kind of society. What we're still seeing is rage. What we're seeing is rage. We're seeing unity. However, what we're also seeing a reclamation. For instance, we saw the reclamation of the flag. The last 10 years, the flag was part of what you call the entrepreneur starter pack. So people who wore the wrist with the Kenyan flag, more often than not, they were entrepreneurs. We have seen on Saturday, Sunday, the reclamation of the Kenyan flag back to its people. So in a sense, it's still. I agree with you, Firoze. It's still a mixed bag. One can't yet concretely say we are now in the revolution. What we are in is when we're still in the early onsets of an uprising. Of an uprising and revolt. Perhaps possibly is because also it's still in early stages, but I wouldn't rule a revolution out immediately, just because even the Kenyan context is very different from the Arab Spring context. Keep in mind this: the context of Arab. There were significantly authoritarian societies, there was still a level of aggressive organization that we saw in Arab Spring, what we saw in Sudan more recently. But for me, the Kenya's power is also its weakness. The fact that we have a lot of expatriates and wazungus and doing all this stuff in Kenya makes this level of disruption very, 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 very potent because of the fragility of also our state. How we are really the center of very many activities by the West.
But let me turn to this question about what are the demands being made. I mean, we're dealing with a country which is an occupied territory. You just mentioned all these international organizations, the big corporations, the NGOs, the white settlers. But most importantly, it's an occupied territory of the American military as well as the British military, and the operations of Mossad and similar forces in Kenya. I mean, Kenya is well known as the strongest base of the Israeli Mossad, a secret service of Israel. To what extent now are the demands about the removal of these military forces coming up? To what extent is there sufficient protest against the dispatching of Kenya police to Haiti? And so are these demands only related to the finance bill, or are we thinking about something wider than that?
The protest began really it was really like the proverbial bread riots, 1917 bread riots, to the extent that it took the left in Russia 10 years to wonder how did the bread riots come faster than we had anticipated. So really, this was really a bread riots kind of moment for Kenya, where it was really the fundamental concern was really on livelihoods. I think now it's gaining now momentum as we continue, particularly if you go on TikTok and also other platforms. It's now gaining political education is happening post the explosion, not prior. So now because of all this happening, it's gaining its own momentum. Recently, today actually, I was seeing a clip online, and there's a lady who was explaining how Kenyan presidents are chosen, and she's talking about how they go to Chatham House, and it's almost like an interview. And and it was this is happening on TikTok, and you're seeing young people engaging. That's when you realize now political education is now happening in real time, whereas before it was what began as really a bread riots kind of moment for this finance bill is too. I mean, the cost of living is unbearable. Is now at the level of where we are happening now. Is now what we are seeing is now political education happening in real time.
I mean, in terms of implications, I mean, okay, it's early days. We watch with hope and anticipation, of course. But what has been interesting has been, for example, in Uganda, the LGBTI movement has issued a statement in support of the uprisings. We've seen that in several countries. And in Nigeria, there's a reference to doing the same thing there. How far do you think what is happening in Kenya has resonance and is likely to stimulate similar opposition happening in other countries?
I think, if it was to go back to my earlier comparative analysis, when I compare this movement to 1952, is that, well, it is Mau, fine even by its creation by the British colonialists, became a thing, and it resonated across the world. Malcolm X talked about it. Everybody talked about it across the world. It is true that Mau and what happened in 1952 fast-tracked the direct exit of the British in Kenya, but it is also true that it didn't, right? Because if you can see the other parts in Africa, the wind of change, the wind of change as the French president then de Gaulle said that it was coming. So I think this is another winds of change moment. And I think we have to locate this, not just, and I think it's going to happen across other parts of Africa because of the weakness, because of the clear weakness of Western hegemony towards these spaces. What are you seeing that in the Sahel? We're just going to now see that now in different parts of Africa, influenced by what has happened in Kenya.
Right. Finally, there's a number of reports, interviews, and so on that I've monitored recently. There is this constant reference to IMF and the World Bank as being the nasty people who are imposing something. But my reading has always been that far from imposing, they are dealing with oligarchs who understood that they could become extremely rich by following the demands of structural adjustment, by following the new emerging neo-colonial capitalism, the neoliberal capitalism. They have a vested interest in the finance bill, and they have a vested interest in not seeing the accumulated debt as being odious debt. In other words, it is not Kenya people who've caused the debt. It has been our oligarchs who have done it. What's your reaction to that?
A couple of things, Firoze. So one is that we've been here before, right? We're not with debt, but Kenya has been here before, and most of Africa has been here before. The late political economist Tanika Mgandariwe called the previous SAPs in Africa, the 1980s to the 90s, Africa's Great Depression, where nothing really was happening and we were going back. And of course, then it was imposed as a political economy tool and said, listen, you guys are not doing out of democracy, you have to chew this thing as well. And we know the story post 1971. There was a document, the tripartite document, 1971-73. It was a global document saying if the West wants to sustain its power, this was the treatment. And Bretton Woods, part of that was SAPs and neoliberalism, how it came to that. Of course, even the West had its own version from student debt to etc. because it was basically SAPs was part of the package of what happened in the 60s. So they saw if too much democracy, they called it. So I think we're living in the same moment. When Elon Musk was buying Twitter, he said the same thing that was said in 1971 when this document was, this tripartite document was created. There's too much democracy in the world. And Elon Musk did the same thing and he's saying that Twitter, there's too much democracy. But unfortunately, the prescription that they were doing now was the same thing. So I think not just Kenyans, but everybody in the world, intellectuals, could see the same prescription, where now you're going the same IMF, World Bank group, where you give African nations debt, and then you give them conditionalities, and the loop. So it was almost like the bag of tricks of empire was well known to everybody. So I think that's on one hand. And on the second hand is that Kenya now in particular, because of what was happening, were in a sense already in a kind of revolutionary moment already, even before, from 2022 coming, we're in a kind of, maybe not revolutionary, let me say we're in a change kind of moment from 2002. First you see the Kenyan state has been unique because unlike many other African states, Kenyans until at least 2 years ago, it was the only African state post independence that the elite infrastructure was intact. So it was the same old dogs having inward squabbles. But unlike Nigeria, where there was coups, where elite infrastructure is removed, Uganda, actually only Kenya and Tanzania. But Tanzania, because of CCM, it's different. But really, in that sense, only Kenya that has sustained that elite infrastructure.
But we had a coup. 2016, 17. That's what the uprisings then were about. That's what the so-called post-election violence was about.
Yes,
there was a coup.
Yeah, there was a coup, but still, it ended up being an elite pact, where Raila Odinga was brought in on one, and then, but also two, they were still part of the same elite formations. I wrote about this actually 2 years, not 2 years ago, and I was talking about how we need to study when that kind of moment where between two orders are fighting. It was really, we're in that kind of moment. Right. So what was interesting was that now we saw, as I read in my piece, we saw a new order emerged very organically. There were Rafarians, this organization of politics, as I mentioned, that came through SAPs, and it created a new political economy, kind of sense that amassed wealth through wheeler dealing. Of course, China played a role in that coming to birth, and then of course changes within Kenya's political structure, particularly devolution. So we created this thing, and that's when now they call themselves the hustlers. So and they removed these guys. They removed what you call the dynasty of power, the old families. They removed them out of power. So I think the last 20 months, what they've been trying to do is trying to build a new infrastructure. Their way into power was, as we rightly know, the cement elite. That's why if you notice, they have been trying to build all this housing. It's really a way of trying to reorganize Kenya's political economy to favor them. But then, as one moment happened that no one had seen, was that now you had these two orders fighting, and then as one moment happened where you had now the Kenyans who are not part of these two orders coming up, as we have seen now, creating a new kind of
politics.
Exactly. The politics was always, and we could tell, before this whole thing, you could hear Uhuru Kenyatta complaining that his mother's vehicles have been taken away, and and something about some land issue, or you talk to politicals within the private sector, you would hear the current regime is taking this particular portfolio of tenders, or it was what we were seeing was just these two orders fighting and squabbling.
Yeah,
and then
that's right.
And they've been washed under their feet by this new wave that nobody had predicted. And I think them coming together yesterday is an attempt.
Another handshake.
Yeah, we have basically elite consolidation, but Kenya has moved so fast, so hard that their politics, it's one of those things that their squabbles Now guys are like, okay, now we're coming for all of you together. Now, whatever order you represent, either the old Lancaster elite, as I've mentioned and call them in different spaces, or this new, this new shiny wheeler dealer hustler kind of elite. I think that kind of wipe of what we are seeing now. That's why it's strange and why it's different, because we're seeing new players, a new kind of logic.
Well, Joe Kobuthi, this has been a fascinating conversation. We have to limit the amount on this particular podcast, but I would love to return to further conversations with you, because I think there are dimensions that you are raising which I'm not seeing elsewhere. And I think these are really important, setting the historical and political context in which these uprisings have taken place. So I'm very grateful to you. And please pass my greetings to everyone at The Elephant and say, please keep up the great work. We're very proud to have you with us today.
Thanks, Firoze. Thanks, Firoze, for having me.
The Daraja Press podcast is produced by myself, Firoze Manji, with the amazing assistance of Pierre Loisel. The music is by Sembene Manji. You can find more podcast episodes, our books, and more at darajapress.com. Thank you for listening.